The crackling fire cast a warm glow on our small campsite. Laughter echoed softly through the trees as we shared stories and roasted marshmallows. The night sky above was a canvas of countless stars, a breathtaking spectacle far removed from the city lights. Our youngest child, a boy of 6, was nestled snugly in his sleeping bag beside me, his small face peaceful in slumber. Sometime in the dead of night, I awoke to an unsettling stillness, a void where his gentle breathing should have been. Panic flared in my chest. I reached over, my hand finding only the cold, empty space where he had been sleeping. A frantic search of the immediate vicinity yielded nothing. His small form was nowhere to be seen. My spouse and I exchanged terrified glances. The only clue was a set of tiny footprints leading away from the tent and into the darkness of the woods. Clutching a flashlight, we followed the tracks, our hearts pounding with each step. The familiar path of our campsite soon dissolved into an unfamiliar terrain. The trees grew closer together here, their branches gnarled and twisted. The forest floor was littered with broken branches and disturbed earth. As we ventured deeper, the signs became more disturbing. Deep gouges marred the bark of the trees, as if some enormous creature had raked its claws against them. Scattered amongst the undergrowth were the remains of animals, half-eaten carcasses picked clean. A sense of dread began to creep into our hearts, a cold premonition of something terrible. The small footprints continued, leading us further into this nightmarish section of the woods. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and there he was, our son. He stood among the trees, bathed in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. His back was to us. Relief washed over us, so potent it almost brought us to our knees. "Hey!" my spouse called out softly, a tremor in their voice. Our son turned. A wide smile stretched across his face, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a smile we hadn't seen before. Behind him, something shifted in the darkness, an enormous bulk, its form indistinct among the trees. And then we saw them. Dozens of shining eyes, pinpricks of light in the blackness, peering out from the shadows. They were arranged in a pattern that made no sense, too many, too bright, belonging to something vast and unseen. They blinked slowly, deliberately, and then looked directly at us. The forest swallowed the last rays of the afternoon sun, leaving me in a dim, hushed world. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves under my boots and the distant caw of a crow. I moved quietly through the trees, my senses alert, scanning for any sign of game. The woods were old here, the trees tall and gnarled, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. Deeper, I ventured, further from the familiar trails. The undergrowth thinned, and the trees stood more spaced apart, creating a sort of natural clearing. It was there that them, standing perfectly still amidst the trees, were several figures. They resembled humans in shape, but something about them was deeply unsettling. They were facing my direction, but they did not react to my presence. Their stillness was absolute, almost statuesque. I paused, studying them, trying to discern what it was that made them so disturbing. As I looked closer, I noticed their eyes. They were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the dim light, and yet I could sense that they were focused on me. A prickle of discomfort ran down my spine. I shifted my gaze away for a moment, scanning the surrounding woods. When I looked back, the figures were a little nearer. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. My heart began to beat a little faster. I turned my back to them, pretending to examine a nearby tree. After a few moments, I glanced over my shoulder. They had moved again. They were significantly closer now, and I could make out more details. Their skin was pale and stretched taut, and their mouths were slightly open. I faced forward and started to walk, increasing my pace. I didn't run, not yet, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed by these silent, unsettling figures was growing stronger. I glanced back again. They were still coming, their pace matching mine, their stillness punctuated only by their silent advance. And their mouths. They seemed wider now, stretched into unnatural grins. I broke into a jog, my boots pounding against the soft earth. I risked another look. They were keeping up, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their mouths impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. Panic began to set in. I ran faster, weaving through the trees, trying to put distance between myself and those silent pursuers. I didn't dare look back for a long time, focusing only on the path ahead, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I stumbled to a halt, leaning against a tree, my lungs burning. I had to know if they were still there. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head. They were. not far behind me, still standing motionless when I faced them, but I knew that the moment I turned away, they would continue their silent approach. And their mouths, they were wider still, gaping black holes in their pale faces. I started to walk again, trying to maintain a steady pace, conserving my energy. I glanced back frequently now, each time confirming their relentless pursuit. They never spoke, never made a sound other than the soft rustle of their feet on the leaves when my back was turned. The woods grew darker as night approached. The shadows deepened, making it harder to see. But I could always make out their pale forms, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light, their impossibly wide mouths like gaping maws. I tried to change direction, hoping to lose them in the denser parts of the forest, but no matter where I went, they followed. It was as if they were tethered to me, their silent, relentless pursuit an inescapable curse. The moon rose, casting long, eerie light through the trees. The figures seemed to grow taller in the moonlight, their shadows stretching and distorting their already unnatural forms. Their mouths seemed to stretch even further, wider than any human mouth could possibly open. I stumbled upon a small stream and waded across, hoping the water would break their connection to me. But when I reached the other side and looked back, they were already there, standing silently on the bank, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their gaping mouths wider. I continued to walk, driven by a primal need to escape, though I knew with a growing certainty that escape was impossible. They were always behind me, always getting closer when I wasn't looking, their silent, gaping presence a constant, looming threat. I found a small, abandoned cabin and cautiously entered, hoping for some respite. But even within the relative safety of the walls, I could sense them outside. I peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. They were there, standing motionless in the clearing, their hollow eyes fixed on the cabin, their mouths impossibly wide. I knew they would eventually find a way in. They always did. I could feel their silent approach, even when I couldn't see them. The air inside the cabin grew colder, heavier. I turned away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the faintest of sounds from outside, a soft rustling in the leaves. I didn't dare look back. I knew what I would see. I could feel their presence just beyond the door, their silent, gaping mouths. The door creaked open. The forest was quiet save for the crackling fire and the gentle sigh of wind through the leaves. We had hiked deep into the woods, seeking a secluded spot far from the noise of civilization. Our tent was pitched beside a small stream, and the night sky above was a canvas of brilliant stars. The next morning, as we explored the area around our campsite, I noticed something unusual, high in the branches of an ancient oak. It was enormous, far larger than any bird's nest or animal den I'd ever encountered. It was oval-shaped and hung suspended from thick limbs, swaying slightly in the breeze. Its surface had a strange texture, almost leathery, and it seemed to pulse with a faint internal light. Intrigued, we approached the tree. The cocoon, for that's what it resembled, was at least the size of a small car. Its color was a sickly yellow-white, and veins of a darker hue crisscrossed its surface. The pulsing was more noticeable now, a slow, rhythmic beat that seemed to emanate from within. We exchanged glances, a shared sense of curiosity and apprehension passing between us. We had to get a closer look. The lowest branches of the oak were still quite high, but we managed to find a fallen log that allowed us to reach them. Climbing carefully, we made our way up until we were level with the colossal cocoon. Up close, the texture was even stranger. It felt almost organic, like stretched skin or hardened flesh. And the pulsing was stronger, accompanied by a faint wet sound from inside. A knot of disquiet tightened in my stomach. As we circled the cocoon, examining it from all angles, I brushed against a thin, almost invisible strand that hung down from its surface. It was sticky, adhering to my skin like glue. I tried to pull it off, but it stretched, thin and sinewy, before finally snapping. Suddenly, more of these strands appeared, seemingly from nowhere. They snaked out from the surface of the cocoon, thin and pale, like living threads. They wrapped around our arms, our legs, tightening their grip with surprising strength. Panic flared within me as I realized we were trapped. The strands were everywhere now, ensnaring us, pulling us closer to the pulsating mass. We struggled, but the more we fought, the tighter the tendrils became, their sticky surface clinging to our clothes and skin. The wet sound from inside the cocoon intensified, accompanied by a series of sharp cracks. A long fissure appeared on its surface, splitting it open from top to bottom. The opening widened, revealing a dark, moist interior. From the depths of the cocoon, something began to emerge. It was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen, a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and segments. Its body was pale and slick, like the inside of the cocoon, and dozens of thin, jointed legs unfolded from its torso. Its head was vaguely insectoid, with large, multifaceted eyes that gleamed in the dim light filtering through the trees. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. A wave of nausea washed over me as I took in its horrifying form. The creature unfolded its many limbs, its movements jerky and unsettling. It seemed to be testing its newfound freedom, its alien eyes scanning its surroundings. Then, its gaze locked onto us, still trapped in the sticky tendrils. A low, guttural sound emanated from its throat, a sound that vibrated through the air and into my bones. It was a sound of hunger, of primal instinct. Its many legs began to move, propelling its grotesque body towards us. We were still held fast by the sticky strands, unable to move, completely vulnerable. The creature approached with terrifying speed, its multifaceted eyes never leaving us. Its gaping maw opened wider, revealing the rows of sharp teeth. I could see the glistening of saliva within its mouth, the anticipation of fresh prey. Its many limbs reached out, their tips adorned with sharp claw-like appendages. The creature was upon us, its alien form looming over me. I could feel its fetid breath on my face, see the intricate details of its horrifying features. Its gaping mouth descended, and the last thing I perceived was the flash of its razor-sharp teeth. Then darkness. But it wasn't the darkness of unconsciousness. It was a different kind of darkness, a suffocating, all-encompassing void. I could still feel the sticky tendrils around me, the faint pulsing of the cocoon nearby, and I could sense the creature, its presence, a cold, malevolent aura. I tried to move, but I was completely immobilized. I could hear soft, wet sounds all around me, the sounds of the creature feeding. A wave of nausea and terror washed over me. How long had I been like this? Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. The feeding sounds continued, interspersed with soft, clicking noises. Then a new sensation, a sharp, piercing pain in my leg. Something was tearing at me, slowly, methodically. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, could only feel the agonizing pain. The pain intensified, spreading through my body. I could feel myself being consumed piece by piece by the grotesque creature that had emerged from the cocoon. The wet sounds continued, closer now, more insistent. The darkness remained, absolute and suffocating. The pain was constant, unrelenting, and the feeding sounds, they were all around me now. A chorus of wet, tearing noises that filled the void. I could feel the creature moving around me, its many limbs brushing against my skin. Its fetid breath was a constant presence, and the pain, it never stopped. The last thing I felt was a sharp tug, followed by an emptiness where my arm had been. The feeding sounds continued, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would soon be gone, completely consumed by the horror that had emerged from the pulsating cocoon. The darkness remained, and the wet sounds, they continued. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as we moved quietly through the woods. My son walked a few paces ahead, his youthful enthusiasm a stark contrast to my seasoned caution. The morning sun dappled through the leaves, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was a perfect day for tracking deer, a tradition we both cherished. The fog descended with an almost unnatural speed. One moment the visibility was clear, the next a swirling white mist had enveloped the woods, reducing our world to a few feet around us. The familiar shapes of trees and bushes became distorted, taking on an eerie, indistinct form. The silence, once comforting, now felt heavy and isolating. It was then that them, tall, elongated shapes at the very edge of my vision, barely discernible through the dense fog. They seemed to stretch upwards, their forms gaunt and distorted, like figures sculpted from the mist itself. They were still, silent sentinels at the periphery of my awareness. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. These were not deer, nor any animal I recognized. Their stillness was unsettling, their very presence a discordant note in the familiar landscape. I kept my son close, my hand occasionally brushing against his back to ensure he was still near. The fog grew denser, making it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. The distorted figures remained at the edge of sight, their tall, gaunt forms occasionally glimpsed through the swirling mist. They did not approach, did not make a sound, but their silent presence was a constant source of disquiet. We paused beside a large oak, trying to get our bearings. The fog was so thick that it felt like a physical barrier. I turned for just a moment, checking the compass in my hand. A fleeting distraction. When I looked back, my son was gone. Panic seized me. I called out, my voice muffled by the dense fog, the sound swallowed by the swirling white. There was no response. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. I began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing desperation, searching for any sign of him. The fog seemed to mock my efforts, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The distorted figures were still there, at the edge of my vision, but now there seemed to be more of them, their tall, gaunt forms appearing and disappearing in the mist. As I searched, I noticed something different about the figures. They were no longer completely still. When I glanced away and then back, their positions seemed to have subtly changed. They were closer, their distorted forms looming slightly larger through the fog, my breath caught in my throat. They had moved while I was searching for my son. They were only moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. I continued my frantic search, my eyes darting between the immediate surroundings and the periphery, trying to keep track of the figures. They were closing in, their silent, distorted forms encircling me in the dense fog. The fog seemed to writhe around them, their tall, gaunt shapes shifting and elongating in the swirling mist. They were still at the edge of my sight, but their presence felt more immediate, more threatening. I stumbled upon a small clearing, the fog momentarily thinning. In the center of the clearing, them. Several of the tall, distorted figures stood motionless, their gaunt forms facing away from me, and between them, on the ground, my son lay still, his small form pale against the damp earth. I started to run towards him, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. But as I moved, the figures turned. Their forms seemed to elongate further, their limbs stretching to impossible lengths, and they began to move towards me, their silent, distorted shapes gliding through the fog with an unnatural grace. I reached my son, dropping to my knees beside him. He was unresponsive, his eyes closed. I reached out to touch him, my hand trembling. Then I noticed something else, something about his form, his shape. It seemed slightly distorted. I looked up. The figures were closer now, their tall, gaunt forms looming over us. The fog swirled around them, obscuring their features, but I could sense their presence, their silent, watchful presence. One of the figures reached out a long skeletal hand. Its fingers were elongated and thin, like branches stripped bare. The hand moved towards my son, its touch. Then the fog swirled again, thicker than ever, obscuring everything. I could no longer see my son, no longer see the figures. I was alone in the swirling white, surrounded by an absolute silence save for the frantic pounding of my own heart. I reached out, my hands grasping at the empty air, searching for him, searching for them. But there was nothing, only the cold, dense fog and the chilling silence. And then a faint sound barely perceptible through the fog, a soft, rustling sound coming from just beyond my reach, a sound that seemed to be growing. The woods at the edge of town always held a certain allure, a boundary between the familiar and the unknown. Tonight, fueled by bravado and the need to prove the old stories wrong, we ventured deeper than usual. The tale of the earth-eater, the thing that tunneled beneath the roots and snatched the unwary, had been a local staple for generations. We, of course, knew better. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky, barely illuminating our path as we pushed through tangled undergrowth. The usual sounds of the night crickets chirping, owls hooting, seemed muted here, replaced by a profound stillness. An unsettling quiet settled over the woods, different from the peaceful silence we expected. We reached the supposed heart of the creature's territory, a small clearing where the trees grew sparse and the ground was unusually soft. We spread out, kicking at the loose soil, daring the myth to manifest. Nothing happened. We exchanged smug glances, the thrill of defiance quickly fading into boredom. Then the ground beneath my feet gave a subtle lurch. It was a brief, almost imperceptible shift, but enough to make me stumble. I glanced around at the others. Had they noticed it too? Their faces were turned towards the spot where Mark had been standing just moments before. Now, there was only a gaping hole in the earth, a dark maw leading into unseen depths. The edges of the hole crumbled slightly, and a fine dust rose into the still night air. Mark was gone. A sound drifted up from the darkness below. It was a wet, tearing sound, followed by a distinct crunching, the sound of something consuming something else. A wave of cold dread washed over me. This was not part of the legend we had scoffed at. We didn't need to speak to understand. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the image of the dark hole and the horrifying sounds echoing in our minds. Behind us we could feel the ground vibrating, a subtle undulation, as something moved rapidly beneath the surface. A section of the path ahead of us buckled and split, the earth erupting in a shower of soil and roots. Sarah screamed, tripping over the uneven ground. Before I could reach her, a pale, sinewy appendage shot out from the fissure, wrapping around her ankle with surprising force. She was yanked downwards with a sickening thud, disappearing into the newly formed hole. The chewing sound returned, closer now, laced with a wet slurping. The ground continued to shift and heave as we scrambled through the trees, our fear lending us a desperate speed. The creature was hunting us, tunneling beneath our feet, anticipating our every move. Another section of ground gave way directly in front of Ben. He cried out as he plunged into the darkness. I didn't see what happened to him, but the sounds that followed. A muffled scream cut short. More of that awful chewing were enough. I was alone now, running blindly through the woods, the sounds of the creature pursuing me just beneath the surface. I could see the ground rippling ahead, a telltale sign of its approach. I veered sharply to the left, hoping to evade it. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming a blur as I ran. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, the creature matching my pace. It was relentless, an unseen predator stalking me from below. I stumbled upon a cluster of large rocks and scrambled over them, hoping the solid ground would offer some respite. For a moment the vibrations ceased. I paused, catching my breath, listening intently. Then the ground beneath the rocks began to tremble. A low growl, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth, rumbled through the forest. The rocks shifted, and a long fissure snaked across the ground between them. I leaped across the widening crack just as something pale and slick erupted from below, snapping its jaws inches from my leg. It was a glimpse of the creature, a mass of writhing tentacles and sharp, jagged teeth, its body unseen beneath the surface. I didn't wait to see more. I ran again, pushing myself to the limit, my lungs burning, my legs aching. The ground behind me continued to erupt, the creature tearing through the earth in pursuit. I reached the edge of the woods, the lights of the town shimmering in the distance. Hope surged through me. If I could just make it to the open fields, away from the trees and the soft earth. But the ground ahead of me began to heave violently. A long, wide crack appeared, stretching across my path, cutting me off from the open fields. The earth on either side of the fissure trembled precariously. From the darkness of the crack I could hear the creature moving, its wet, tearing sounds closer than ever. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, the lights of the town now a distant, unattainable beacon. The ground around me began to sink, slowly at first, then faster. I could feel the loose soil giving way beneath my feet. The growling from below intensified, and the air filled with the stench of damp earth and something else. Something foul and indescribable. I looked down, and the ground was falling away, pulling me into the darkness. I reached out, grasping at the roots of nearby trees, trying to anchor myself, but the soil was too loose, too unstable. I could see the creature now, its pale, writhing form filling the widening hole. Its many mouths, each lined with rows of sharp teeth, opened wide. The growling was deafening, and the stench was overwhelming. The ground continued to give way, and I could feel myself sliding downwards towards the darkness, towards the creature. Its jaws snapped shut inches from my face. Then the ground stopped sinking. I was suspended precariously above the darkness, clinging to a few remaining roots. Below me, I could see the creature, its pale form shifting and writhing, its many mouths snapping hungrily. The roots I was holding onto began to crack. I could feel them pulling away from the loose soil. The growling from below grew louder, more insistent. The creature was still there, waiting. The roots snapped. The trail had been long and winding, leading me deep into the wilderness. As dusk approached, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin nestled amongst the trees. It appeared abandoned, the windows dark and lifeless. Seeking shelter for the night, I cautiously approached. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a single, dusty room. The interior was sparse, containing only a rough-hewn table and a couple of rickety chairs. What caught my attention, however, were the numerous animal pelts hanging from the walls. They looked recently acquired, the fur still supple and glossy. A knot of disquiet formed in my stomach at the sight. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor, the silence of the cabin amplifying the sound of the rustling nylon. Darkness descended completely, and the woods outside became a tapestry of shadows. I lay awake for a while, the image of the animal pelts imprinted on my mind. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by a scraping sound. It seemed to be coming from outside, approaching my tent. A dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the forest floor. My heart began to pound in my chest. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, cast an eerie luminescence on the surrounding trees. And then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the clearing near the tree line. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but something was terribly wrong. It appeared to be wrapped in human skin, but the fit was poor, patchy in places, revealing glimpses of something else beneath. The skin looked stretched and ill-fitting, like a garment several sizes too large. The thing stood there for a moment, its posture awkward, as if it was still learning how to use its limbs. It shifted its stance, a jerky, uncoordinated motion. A wave of primal terror washed over me. This was not natural. Without a second thought, I scrambled out of the tent and ran. I plunged into the dense woods, the undergrowth tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear it. The sound of something heavy moving through the brush, following me. The dragging sound was gone, replaced by a clumsy, uneven gait. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, the trees blurring into a dark, indistinguishable mass. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning. I didn't dare to look back, but I could sense it behind me, its pursuit relentless. The thought of that thing wrapped in human skin, its awkward movements spurred me onward. The chase continued, the darkness my only companion, the creature my persistent shadow. The entrance to the cave was a narrow fissure in the earth, concealed by a tangle of roots and ferns. I squeezed through the opening, the world outside fading behind me as I descended into the cool, damp darkness. The beam of my headlamp cut a swathe through the blackness, illuminating the rough, uneven walls of the passage. A peculiar sound echoed through the cavern, a rapid clicking chatter that seemed to emanate from the deeper recesses of the cave. It was an unusual sound, unlike anything I had encountered in my previous explorations, and an insistent curiosity drew me further into the subterranean maze. The passage opened into a larger chamber. The beam of my lamp danced across the walls, revealing a disturbing scene. Scattered across the cave floor were fragments of bone, many of them bearing the distinct marks of gnawing. Deep gouges marred the rock surfaces, as if something with sharp claws had raked at the stone. An unsettling feeling settled over me, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I decided to turn back to retrace my steps and exit this unsettling place. But as I approached the narrow passage through which I had entered, I found it blocked. A pile of rocks and earth had collapsed, sealing off the only way out. Panic began to bubble in my chest. The chittering sound, which had faded somewhat, now seemed to be getting more intense, originating from the deeper parts of the cave ahead. I swept my headlamp across the darkness. Something was moving. A mass of pale forms writhed in the distance, just at the edge of my light. As they moved, more details became visible. They were creatures unlike any I could have imagined. Their skin was a sickly white, and they appeared to be blind, their faces lacking discernible eyes. Numerous limbs, thin and elongated, propelled them across the cave floor in a disturbing, scuttling fashion. They moved as a single entity, a shifting, pale carpet of flesh. Then I noticed their heads were raised, their featureless faces oriented in my direction. They were sniffing the air, their bodies twitching. A horrifying realization dawned upon me. They were sensing my presence. I was not alone in the darkness. I was fresh meat. The campfire crackled merrily, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. We settled into our sleeping bags, the quiet of the woods enveloping us after a day of hiking. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filled the cool evening atmosphere. A faint sound reached us from the distance, a rapid thudding, like hooves striking the ground. We exchanged glances, a shared curiosity in our eyes. It sounded like a horse, or perhaps several, galloping through the underbrush. We strained our ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the dense foliage obscured any visual confirmation. The sound grew. The thudding became more distinct, the rhythm quickening. It seemed to be circling our campsite, the sound moving around our small clearing. The intensity of the hoofbeats increased, the ground beneath our sleeping bags beginning to vibrate. A low rumble accompanied the rapid thudding, resonating through the earth. The vibrations intensified, shaking our tents. The noise was deafening, a furious pounding that filled the night. Then a tremendous impact rocked our campsite. Something unseen slammed into the tents with immense force. The sounds of tearing fabric and snapping poles filled the air, followed by cries of pain and the sickening crunch of bone. Panic seized me. I scrambled out of my tent, the world a chaos of collapsing canvas and terrified shouts. I could feel the ground bucking beneath my feet as the unseen force continued its assault. Without thinking, I turned and ran, plunging into the darkness of the woods. Branches whipped at my face, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me. But I didn't dare to stop. After what felt like an eternity of running blindly through the trees, I finally paused, gasping for breath. The furious pounding of hooves still echoed in the distance, gradually receding. A morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand what had just happened, compelled me to look back. Through the gaps in the trees, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon, I could make out the ravaged campsite. Tents were flattened, ripped to shreds, and then I noticed them. Just beyond the edge of the trees, where the moonlight touched the darkness, were outlines. Enormous shapes, vaguely equine, their forms flickering and indistinct as if they were not entirely within our reality. Skeletal structures, impossibly large, galloping with terrifying speed. The sound of their hooves, though fainter now, still shook the very air. They moved with a speed and power that defied explanation, their forms shifting and wavering at the periphery of sight, a nightmare made real just beyond the veil of our world. The trees stood tall and silent around my isolated campsite. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. I enjoyed these solitary excursions, the deep quiet of the woods a welcome respite from the everyday clamor. During an afternoon exploration, venturing further than my usual perimeter, I came across something peculiar. A raised area of earth, unlike the natural undulations of the terrain, sat nestled between a cluster of ancient pines. Its shape was unusual, almost deliberately formed. Curiosity, an ever-present companion on these trips, prompted me to investigate. I found a sturdy branch and began to dig. The soil was surprisingly loose, yielding easily to my efforts. As I excavated deeper, the texture of the earth changed, becoming denser, almost clay-like. Then my makeshift shovel struck something solid. Brushing away the remaining soil with my hands, I uncovered a portion of what appeared to be fabric, dark and brittle. Carefully, I continued to unearth the object. Slowly, a grotesque form emerged from the earth. It was a figure seemingly preserved by the soil. Its limbs were elongated, stretched to an impossible length. The skin was taut and dry, clinging to the bone. Its most disturbing feature was its mouth, which appeared to be sewn shut with thick, dark thread. A wave of revulsion and terror washed over me. I recoiled, scrambling backward away from the unearthed horror. My breath hitched in my throat. I had to get away from this place, from this abomination. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the forest floor. The image of the mummified figure with its stitched mouth was burned into my vision. I didn't look back, didn't dare to see if anything was following. Exhaustion eventually caught up to me as twilight began to creep through the trees. My legs ached, my lungs burned. I had to stop. I found a relatively clear patch of ground and hastily pitched my small tent, seeking a fragile sense of security within its thin nylon walls. Sleep came fitfully, filled with unsettling images. Sometime during the night, I awoke to a strange sensation. The ground beneath my sleeping bag felt fluid, almost as if the earth itself was shifting. I lay still, listening intently, but heard nothing beyond the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. I dismissed it as a trick of my tired mind and eventually drifted back to sleep. The morning brought a new level of horror. I awoke to find myself partially buried. Soil clung to my face, my hair, my clothes. My arms were pinned to my sides by the weight of the earth. Panic seized me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My mouth was sealed, stitched shut with coarse, dark thread. Frantically, I struggled against the suffocating embrace of the soil, but my efforts were futile. Something had happened during the night. Something had come for me. A subtle but undeniable pressure began to build from below. It wasn't the feeling of being simply trapped. It was a pull, a downward drag. I thrashed against the earth that held me captive. A silent scream trapped within my stitched lips. The pulling intensified. Slowly, inexorably, I began to sink into the soil. The trail markers had become sparse and then vanished entirely. We consulted the map, a growing knot of apprehension tightening in our chests. A collective, silent agreement settled upon us. We had strayed from our intended path. After what felt like an eternity of winding through dense foliage, the landscape began to transform. The vibrant green of the forest gave way to a somber palette of greys and blacks. The trees here were skeletal, their branches reaching skyward like charred fingers. The ground beneath our boots crunched with the sound of burnt undergrowth. An unnerving stillness permeated this section of the woods, an absence of the usual rustling leaves and birdsong. As dusk began to paint the sky in shades of purple and deep orange, we decided to set up camp. The silence of this place was profound, amplifying the slightest sounds of our preparations, the rustle of sleeping bags, the clink of cookware. Once darkness enveloped us, huddled around a small fire, a new sound emerged. Footfalls. They circled our campsite, just beyond the perimeter of the firelight, soft, almost imperceptible at times, but undeniably there. We exchanged glances, a shared anxiety passing between us. Each snap of a twig underfoot sent a jolt through our tense bodies. Despite our strained gazes into the darkness, nothing was visible beyond the flickering flames. The next morning, one of our companions was gone. His sleeping bag lay empty. In his place sat a figure that resembled him, but with eyes that were vacant holes in a gaunt face. Its expression was fixed, devoid of any recognizable emotion. A wave of icy dread washed over the remaining group. Another day passed in this desolate place. That night, the circling footsteps returned. The following dawn brought another disappearance, another horrifying replacement. The vacant-eyed doppelgangers now outnumbered us. Their presence was a constant, silent threat. The realization dawned with chilling clarity. This was not a normal forest. Something here was taking our companions, replacing them with these hollow imitations. A primal urge to escape took root within me. Under the cloak of night, while the others, the originals and the copies, remained still around the dying embers of the fire, I made my move. I slipped away from the campsite, my heart pounding against my ribs. The burnt ground crunched softly beneath my feet as I moved deeper into the darkness. Behind me I could sense them, not through sound but through an instinctive awareness. I began to run, pushing through the skeletal trees, their charred branches snagging at my clothes. The forest floor was uneven, treacherous in the darkness, but I dared not slow my pace. The feeling of pursuit intensified. I could almost feel their presence gaining on me, their silent forms moving with an unnatural swiftness through the desolate woods. The image of those hollowed-out faces burned in my mind, fueling my desperate flight. I ran blindly, the darkness swallowing me whole, the knowledge that they were still behind me, my only constant companion. The entrance to the cave was a jagged maw in the side of the mountain, exhaling a damp, earthy scent. Our headlamps cut cones through the gloom as we descended, the beam bouncing off slick, uneven rock walls. Water trickled down the stone, forming miniature waterfalls that vanished into unseen depths. The silence within the earth was profound, broken only by the crunch of our boots on loose scree and the occasional clang of metal against rock. We moved as a unit, 4 of us, each with years of experience in these subterranean labyrinths. The missing hiker had been alone, a novice, and had ventured too deep. Hours had passed since his last communication, and the air above had grown cold with worry. Deeper we went, the tunnels narrowing, forcing us to proceed single file. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a clammy chill permeated the air. The beam of my headlamp illuminated strange formations, stalactites hanging like petrified tears, stalagmites rising from the floor like grotesque teeth. The world outside, with its familiar sounds and sunlight, felt impossibly distant. Then the sound began, a faint scratching, almost imperceptible at first. It seemed to emanate from the rock itself, a subtle rasping that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. My hand instinctively went to the radio, clipped to my vest, but there was nothing to report, not yet. The scratching grew more insistent as we continued our descent. It was all around us now, a chorus of tiny abrasions against the stone. I swept my headlamp across the walls, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the cold, damp rock glistening in the artificial light. The tunnel constricted further, so narrow that we had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The scraping intensified, seeming to come from directly above and below. A fine dust rained down on us, gritty against my skin. I felt a knot of apprehension tighten in my stomach. Emerging into a slightly larger cavern, we paused, our beams converging on the ceiling. It was then that them, pale forms, dozens of them, clinging to the rock above. Their bodies were elongated and thin, their skin a sickly white. They had no eyes, just smooth, featureless sockets where eyes should have been. Long, spindly fingers, impossibly long, scraped against the stone as they moved, their limbs contorting in ways that defied natural anatomy. They were silent, save for the incessant scratching, their eyeless faces tilted downwards as if sensing our presence. A shiver ran down my spine, a primal fear unlike anything I had experienced before. These were not creatures of the surface world. They were something ancient, something that had evolved in the absolute darkness of this subterranean realm. The scraping intensified as some of the creatures began to descend, their two long fingers reaching, stretching towards us. They moved with a fluid, unsettling grace, their pale bodies gliding along the ceiling as if it were water. We backed away, our lights frantically searching for another passage, any escape from this silent, horrifying spectacle. The tunnel behind us was too narrow to retreat quickly. The scraping was deafening now, a cacophony of stone against bone or something like bone. One of the creatures dropped soundlessly from the ceiling, landing with a soft thud on the ground a few feet away. Its eyeless face turned towards me, and I could sense, rather than see, its focus. Its long fingers twitched, reaching. We pressed on deeper into the labyrinth, the scraping pursuing us, echoing in the confined spaces. The creatures were all around us now, above, below, on the walls. Their silent, pale forms were a constant presence in the periphery of my vision. The tunnels twisted and turned, a maze of rock and shadow. We moved quickly, our breath coming in ragged gasps, the beam of my headlamp shaking with the intensity of my fear. The scraping never ceased, a constant reminder of the silent horrors that surrounded us. Another cavern larger than the last. Our lights illuminated more of the creatures, their numbers seemingly endless. They clung to every surface, their long fingers reaching, waiting. One of my teammates stumbled, falling to the ground. Before I could reach him, several of the pale figures descended, their silent forms engulfing him. The scraping intensified in that spot. A frantic, desperate sound. Then silence, save for the ongoing chorus of scraping from the others. We didn't stop, we couldn't stop. We pressed on, the image of my fallen teammate seared into my mind. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, each turn revealing more of the eyeless creatures. The scraping was now so loud that it vibrated through my bones. I could feel their presence, their silent, watchful presence all around me. The air grew colder, heavier. I rounded a corner and found myself in a dead end. A sheer rock face rose before me, offering no escape. I turned back, my light sweeping across the tunnel. The creatures were there, blocking my path, their pale forms filling the narrow space. They were closer now, their long fingers reaching, their eyeless faces tilted towards me. The scraping continued. A relentless, chilling sound. I raised my headlamp, the beam illuminating their silent, waiting forms. Then the light went out. The narrow passage opened abruptly. My headlamp beam widened, illuminating a space that stole my breath, not with beauty, but with a silent, petrifying grandeur. It was a chamber of impossible size, stretching beyond the reach of my light, and it was filled. Piles, mountains, hills of bone. My boots crunched on the fragments scattered across the uneven floor as I ventured deeper. The sheer volume was staggering. I ran a gloved hand over a femur, its surface smooth and cold. Animal bones, I assumed, a mass die-off, perhaps centuries ago. But as my light danced across the heaps, a different shape caught my eye. A skull, too round, too delicate, human. Dread, cold and sharp, pierced through my initial shock. I knelt, sifting through the pile. Another skull, then a ribcage, undeniably human in its form. A hand, the slender phalanges still connected. My stomach clenched. This wasn't a natural graveyard. This was something else, something far more sinister. I moved from one bone mound to the next, my beam revealing the same horrifying truth. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Human remains piled carelessly as if they were refuse. And each bone bore the same disturbing marks. Clean, precise gnaw marks, stripping the bone bare. What could have done this? What creature possessed such an appetite, such meticulous efficiency? A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm me. I needed to leave now. This place felt tainted, violated. I turned to retrace my steps, my light cutting a swathe through the darkness. The passage back seemed miles away, the silence of the chamber amplifying the frantic pounding of my heart. Then a sound, a dry, scraping noise from behind me. I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I rotated. My lamp beam swept across the cave wall, and there it was, pale, emaciated, a figure clinging to the rough rock, its elongated limbs moving with a fluid, unsettling grace. Its skin was stretched taut over sharp angles, reflecting the weak light in a sickly sheen, and its mouth, a jagged line filled with needle-sharp teeth. It descended inch by inch, its form growing larger, more distinct. Its eyes, dark and deep-set, fixed on me. The scraping sound intensified as its claws found purchase on the stone. It was coming down, toward me. I stood paralyzed, my mind a screaming void. The beam of my headlamp held steady on the creature, illuminating its horrifying advance. It reached the floor with a soft thud. Its limbs, impossibly long, unfolded. It began to move toward me. The scraping stopped. The only sound was the frantic hammering of my own pulse. It drew nearer. Its pale form filled my vision, then nothing.